how the first empire in history really collapsed. Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we travel back to the very origins of imperial power, where a man unified cities, crushed kingdoms, and imposed his law from the Euphrates to the mountains of Iran. In the scorching dust of Mesopotamia rose an unprecedented empire, the Akkadian Empire. Sargon, a visionary king and relentless conqueror, laid the foundations of the world as we know it: permanent armies, centralized administration, imperial cult. But within a few generations, everything collapsed. Only fragments of clay tell the tale of an empire fallen into oblivion. But before we embark on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and have a good trip. Around 2400, humanity finds itself at a crossroads of innovations and political organizations, with a nascent interconnectedness between the centers of civilization. At this time, writing is still rare and oral traditions dominate, but the first centralized states are emerging, laying the groundwork for empire and international trade relations. This panorama encompasses Egypt of the Old Kingdom, the Proto-Harappan Indus Valley, advanced Neolithic cultures in China, the beginnings of the Bronze Age in Anatolia and the Aegean Sea, and developments in Europe and the Saharan Africa. Trade networks are beginning to link these regions through amber, obsidian, and copper, initiating a commercial and cultural web that will gradually expand. In Egypt, during the Old Kingdom, in the 5th and 6th dynasties, pharaonic authority reaches its peak. At Saqqara, near Memphis, the funerary site is already famous for the step pyramid of Djoser. But it is in this era that the rulers of these dynasties will perfect funerary architecture and expand the temples. The monuments of Saqqara, built of limestone and adorned with hieroglyphs, celebrate the divine power of the pharaohs. The pharaohs of the 5th dynasty, such as Userkaf, Sayhure, and Unas, the latter being the last king of the dynasty, profoundly impact the administrative organization. They place governors at the head of the nomes, tasked with collecting taxes, recruiting workers for major projects, and transmitting royal orders. Although some responsibilities are delegated, the throne remains at the center of power, supported by its religious legitimacy. The 6th dynasty sees the reign of Teti, Pepi the Fern, and Pepi the Sin, whose longevity is legendary. The administration becomes more refined, with scribes recording harvests, monitoring grain stocks, and supervising irrigation corvées. Egypt relies on a hierarchical state, where the power of the pharaoh is reflected in the Great Pyramids. In the Indus Valley, around 2400, the Proto-Harappan phase prepares the rise of the Indus civilization, which will reach its peak between 2600 and 1900. Communities structured into villages and early urban centers exploit the annual floods of the river to develop surplus agriculture. Urban planning is already observed, with streets traced according to a regular layout. The mastery of fired brick, grain storage facilities, and sanitation systems emerge at the end of the period. Trade develops, with artisans producing carnelian beads and seals engraved with stylized animals, characteristic of Indus writing. These objects likely travel by camel or boat to neighboring regions. Lapis lazuli, sourced from Badakhshan, present-day Afghanistan, is a precious good exchanged, particularly with Mesopotamia. By the Proto-Harappan phase, an interregional trade network is established, spreading this valuable mineral. We are now heading to China. Around 2400, the Longshan culture dominates the central plain and surrounding areas before the appearance of the early Tu culture, dated around 1900. The The Longshan culture, active from 3000 to 1900, is distinguished by fine, dark pottery, a sign of great technical skill. Longshan communities establish fortified villages, sometimes protected by ditches or palisades, reflecting rivalries between neighboring groups. The tombs of the time contain ritual objects made of jade and polished stone tools. Although bronze metallurgy does not emerge until a millennium later, experimental metallurgy may have taken place. Social hierarchies are becoming clearer, but power remains local, distributed among various rival chiefs. This marks the beginnings of larger kingdoms in proto-historic China. In Anatolia, around 2400, several sites begin to emerge, including the city of Troy, which is at its Troy to Three phases between 2600 and 2250. These archaeological levels reveal impressive fortifications, wealthy housing, and already advanced urban planning. The citadel, protected by massive stone walls, reflects the desire for defense against attacks. Troy occupies a strategic position, controlling maritime trade between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. In the Aegean Sea, at the beginning of the Aegean Bronze Age, the islands of the Cyclades and Crete initiate their cultural development. In Crete, the pre-palatial phase precedes the construction of the great Minoan palaces, such as Knossos, which will develop after 2000. Around 2400, Minoan society organizes into agrarian communities. Although a unified state is still absent, signs of hierarchical structuring emerge, with influential local elites engaged in exchanges with the Cyclades and Anatolia. Fine pottery, metals, and decorative objects circulate throughout the Aegean, promoting cultural mixing. The Cyclades, for their part, offer white marble statuettes, found in graves, but their function remains subject to debate. In Europe and in the Saharan Africa, phenomena of organization and technological diffusion appear around 2400. In Western and Atlantic Europe, the megalith phenomenon, which began in the 5th millennium, continues with local variations. Menhirs and dolmens, such as those at Karnak or in the northern Iberian Peninsula, testify to collective beliefs and complex funeral practices. Pastoral and agricultural communities are already exchanging goods at medium distances, although large-scale circulation is still limited. Metallurgy also appears in Europe, with copper objects and rudimentary alloys intended for functional or ornamental uses. Copper deposits are exploited in an artisanal manner, and extraction and smelting techniques are transmitted on a small community scale. Agro-pastoral practices evolve, with the use of a rudimentary plow and the extension of cereal cultivation. In the Danube and Balkan areas, exchanges of salt, flint, metals, and decorated ceramics testify to regional contacts. South of the Sahara, in the Sahelian Band, societies of trans-Saharan pastoralists develop. At this time, the Sahara is less arid and has ecological corridors allowing caravans, mainly composed of herds, to move over long distances. Rock engravings in the Air Massif, Niger, or at Tassili Najer, Algeria, show animals, attesting to the presence of pastoral populations. Although iron metallurgy is not yet dominant, signs of early metallurgical experimentation, particularly on copper and iron, appear in isolated villages. Water drilling techniques, while rudimentary, are sufficient to support semi-nomadic groups that move to feed their herds. This Sahelian era, well distinct from riverine civilizations, lives in harmony with the environment while incorporating external influences through discrete exchange networks. Around 2400, these embryonic global exchange networks begin to connect several remote areas. These are not yet large merchant fleets, but small groups of traders and caravanners using land and river routes. Baltic amber, prized for its translucence and golden hue, circulates from the shores of the Baltic Sea to Western Europe and beyond. Although these flows remain modest, amber is already considered a precious material used for jewelry or in funeral rituals. The Anatolian obsidian, a vitreous volcanic rock, is also sought after for the production of cutting tools, thanks to its hardness and sharp edge. Extracted mainly in central Anatolia, it is traded for metals or rare goods, and is found as far as mainland Greece and the Cyclades. Copper from Umbria, a region in central Italy where early mining evidence can be found, is the subject of emerging trade. The volumes remain low compared to those of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, when trade alliances will become more systematic. However, some influx of copper is already noted towards the Alpine or Balkan regions, where rudimentary metallurgy is practiced, and towards the southern part of the Italian peninsula for making utility or ceremonial objects. The idea of a trade route linking the Adriatic Sea to central Italy is beginning to take shape without suggesting a single path. Many local roads, adjusted according to the terrain and the more or less hostile presence of other peoples, form a network of often ephemeral connections. These early long-distance trades, whether concerning Baltic amber, Anatolian obsidian, or Italian copper, demonstrate that societies around 2400 are already capable of establishing contacts beyond their immediate surroundings. These exchanges likely involve only a minority of people from the elites or specialized crafts. At this time, material and social comfort still closely depends on the ability to store, redistribute, and transform these resources. The rarity of certain materials and the symbolic prestige they bring encourage some local chiefs, petty rulers, or merchant communities to forge economic relationships on an inter-regional scale. The world around 2400 appears as a vast patchwork of moving civilizations. Egypt, under the Old Kingdom, stands out for its exemplary centralization, illustrated by the pyramids of Saqqara. The Indus Valley is already organized around regulated urbanism and trade networks of lapis lazuli. In China, still in the late Neolithic, the Longshan culture asserts its identity, heralding the emergence of more organized political structures. At the other end of the continent, Anatolia and the Aegean region see the development of the first fortified citadels, like Troy II and III, and island cultures in Crete. In Europe, the Atlantic megaliths and dispersed metallurgies reveal a dynamism based on the circulation of crafted goods, while the Saharan Africa accommodates trans-Saharan pastoralists, taking advantage of a Sahara that is less arid. In this vast ensemble, one must not overlook the trade routes, sometimes tenuous, sometimes better established, that connect different regions. Although the concept of globalization is anachronistic for this time, humanity is already traveling, trading, and recognizing the strategic value of certain raw materials. Local productions, such as amber, copper, or obsidian, gain precious status as soon as they leave their homeland. Local artisans and chiefs, when they obtain these unique materials, quickly hurry to work with or showcase them, reinforcing their authority. This quick overview of the state of the world around 2400 highlights some major cultural centers and the beginnings of long-distance exchanges. Despite the diversity of societies, centralized like in Egypt or organized into city-states in development like in the Indus Valley or Anatolia, a common thread emerges: the search for rare resources, the exchange of valued objects, and the mastery of increasingly specialized artisanal techniques. This era is characterized by a quest for optimization, whether in urban planning, centralizing powers, or exploring distant territories to bring back precious minerals. With new forms of organization and refined artisanal productions, these civilizations lay the groundwork for future great empires. It is an age of growth and adaptation, driven by a renewed creative impetus. Each region seeks to stand out. Funerary architecture, planned urbanism, prestige objects, networks for sourcing exotic goods. Even if these worlds may not all know each other, raw materials are beginning to cross borders and already connect, like the links of a chain, communities that are sometimes distant. Around 2400 before Christ, although the globe was dotted with isolated regions, it was not entirely compartmentalized. Common trends emerged, such as the development of metallurgy, the structuring of centralized powers, and the quest for rare objects. Egypt flourished along the Nile. The Indus Valley combined early urban models with the trade of lapis lazuli. The Longshan in China laid the foundations of a refined civilization. Anatolia fortified its citadels. The Aegean entered its pre-palatial phase. Megalithic Europe erected its stones, and the Saharan Africa organized around nomadic pastoralism. Meanwhile, pioneering artisans and merchants transported amber, obsidian, and copper to new horizons at the cost of perilous crossings, outlining the first milestones of international trade. It is this mosaic of circulations and ambitions that gives the third millennium before Christ a face already turned towards the conquest of knowledge, resources, and openings beyond local horizons. In the south of present-day Iraq, in the alluvial plain formed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, several cities emerged that, between 2800 and 2400 before Christ, constitute the heart of pre-imperial Mesopotamia. These cities are not united under a single power, but form independent political entities, each fiercely protective of its autonomy. Among the most influential are Uruk, Lagash, and Umma. The ambient aridity is compensated by the ingenuity of the inhabitants. A meticulously maintained network of irrigation canals makes these lands fertile. Agricultural surpluses stimulate population growth, promote public construction, the specialization of trades, and the rise of an administrative system. Uruk, considered one of the oldest cities in the world, reflects the vitality of the region. It probably reaches tens of thousands of inhabitants, a considerable figure for the time. The neighborhoods are organized around monumental complexes made of sun-dried bricks covered with clay plaster. At the center, vast temples dominate the city, including the famous abode of the sky. Here, priests honor Inanna, the goddess of fertility and war, a major figure in the Sumerian pantheon. Economic, ritual, and administrative functions converge here. The temple redistributes harvests, controls a portion of the workforce, and supervises numerous commercial activities. Further to the east, Lagash shines for its early development. By the mid-3rd millennium, it becomes a major hub of Sumerian culture. Temples and palaces are built there, called in Sumerian Egal, great house for the palace, house of the god for the temple. This architecture reflects the importance of religious power, but also the rise of a secular elite. Political life is organized around the Lugal, literally the great man. This term eventually designates a quasi-monarchical role, a war chief and guarantor of cosmic balance, as prosperity is perceived as a reflection of a divine order maintained by rights and political decisions. Umma is primarily known to historians thanks to ancient cuneiform tablets, recounting its border conflict with Lagash. Land disputes between cities often concern canal management and field demarcation, vital issues given the importance of water in agriculture. Wars fought by militias are generally seasonal and erupt after harvests, when the workforce is available. The Sumerian city-states do not form large empires, but a fluctuating network of alliances and rivalries. Uruk can temporarily ally with Lagash against Umma, before new coalitions form in a perpetual cycle. For an international audience, it must be emphasized that Sumerian Mesopotamia is not a centralized regime in the modern sense. The religious infrastructure plays an essential role. Temples, often called egal when they serve as administrative centers, act as economic entities. They centralize harvests, store goods, manage workers, and ensure food redistribution, particularly during religious festivals or after disasters. Beyond their cultic function, they structure civic life, strengthen the identity of the city, encourage craftsmanship, fund walls and canals, and sometimes pay soldiers for defense. In this context, the Lugal exercises a sacralized power. He is not only the military leader, he also serves as an intermediary between the gods and men. During rituals, he is handed symbols of authority such as the mace or the tiara. Without being systematically deified, he receives a supernatural mission to ensure the proper execution of rites, to supervise the economy, and to lead the army in case of aggression. The political and religious prestige is then closely intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Alliances between Sumerian city-states are often formed through diplomatic marriages or exchanges of gifts such as gold jewelry or exotic shells. Conflicts mainly arise over essential resources, such as water and arable land. The contested territories are often located in the blurred border between two city-states. Although regular, wars are limited. Each city mobilizes soldier farmers overseen by specialists, such as archers or chariot drivers. Bronze weapons testify to a mastered but costly metallurgy. A major turning point occurs around 3400–3300 before Christ, with the emergence of cuneiform writing in Uruk. Initially composed of pictograms inscribed on wet clay tablets, it develops in most Sumerian city-states. The signs evolve into lines and chevrons, hence the term cuneiform, derived from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Writing is primarily used to finalize economic transactions, inventory grain reserves, or list personnel, reflecting an already advanced administration. This writing allows the Sumerians to develop more complex management forms. Trained scribes in schools attached to temples record the movements of goods, the names of workers, or the quantities of livestock sacrificed during ceremonies. This invention offers urban elites a decisive advantage: the ability to keep records of complex transactions. Clay tablets, easy to produce, function as accounting records. A cylinder seal, a small engraved stone roll, authenticates each document by marking the agreement of an individual or an institution. At the same time, other technical innovations transform the social and economic life of the region. The invention of the solid wheel, documented around the middle of the 3rd millennium, facilitates the transport of heavy goods. In a context where the construction of monumental buildings requires huge quantities of raw bricks and wooden beams, this tool is revolutionary. Made from sturdy wooden planks with an axle, the wheel allows for the hauling of larger loads on carts pulled by oxen or donkeys. Although rudimentary, this means of locomotion stimulates exchanges between city and countryside and speeds up the supply of temples and palaces with raw materials. The use of river sailing appears in Lower Mesopotamia, where the network of river canals is dense. The earliest representations of sailing boats date back to the end of the 4th millennium, but their usage spreads during the Sumerian pre-imperial period. The sail allows for upstream navigation and the transport of large cargoes on barges or hollowed-out tree trunk boats. This process facilitates the distribution of grains, flour, and manufactured products between the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates, thus boosting interurban trade and the creation of commercial outposts at strategic points along the river. The standardization of bricks marks a turning point in Mesopotamian rationalization. From the recent Uruk period, around 3300–3100 before Christ, molds for uniform bricks allow for rapid production for large construction projects. Each city has brickworks where specialized workers shape and dry the clay, sometimes mixed with straw to enhance cohesion. These bricks, whether air-dried or fired, facilitate the construction of walls, platforms, and temples. The Sumerians also developed drainage techniques to limit erosion caused by the floods of the Euphrates. Culturally, architecture, sculpture, and goldsmithing experienced significant development. Votive statue heads in alabaster or diorite testify to impressive craftsmanship, often characterized by large eyes, symbolizing the adoration of the gods. The lyre and harp are already used during religious ceremonies, and the cuneiform tablets, blending writing and rudimentary drawings, reveal the existence of myths and hymns, reflecting an oral and written culture transmitted by the literate elites. The expansion of Sumerian cities, made possible by economic innovations and optimizations, remains fragile. Diplomatic tensions persist. When Uruk seeks to extend its influence, it confronts the power of Lagash or Ur, all keen to ensure their access to water. Conflicts often take the form of quick campaigns. Enemy fields are ravaged, reserves burned, livestock captured, and brought back as trophies. These offensives can lead to a treaty or a truce, lasting a few years, without stabilizing the situation durably. In this pre-imperial Mesopotamia, the prestige of the Lugal rests on his ability to lead the seasonal war. Cuneiform inscriptions from the temples mention some of these rulers, such as Eannatum of Lagash, around 2500 before Christ, known for his network of canals and his campaigns against Ummah, imposing reparations in kind. His victories illustrate the crucial political role of water. Diverting a rival supply becomes a bargaining lever. The issue goes beyond land possession, touching on agricultural prosperity in a challenging environment. On a religious level, the temple acts as a counterweight to the Lugal. A collaboration is established between the high priest, often from an influential family, and the royal power. The Lugal sometimes attempts to interfere in clerical affairs, controlling the festive calendar or the sacred grain stocks, which sparks opposition from the priests. Arbitrations such as divination or oracles are then sought. The ideology of power is based on the idea that the sovereign is chosen by the gods as long as he respects their commandments. If he proves unworthy, by neglecting the temple or waging bad wars, the deities may turn away from him, hastening the ruin of his people. The role of the eagle in the city illustrates the centralized organization of resources. The expression, which literally means great house, often refers to the palace of the Lugal or the main administrative temple. Archaeologists find near large religious complexes, warehouses, grain processing areas, textile workshops, or pottery facilities. The population is divided into various trades: scribes, potters, weavers, brewers, blacksmiths, each contributing to the urban economy. Part of the profits goes to the temple, another part serves to pay the workers with rations of grain, oil, and beer. This management is made possible by writing and record keeping, while the invention of the wheel and river sail facilitates the transport of goods. For modern observers, this period is a decisive crossroads. Technical inventions such as standardized bricks, the wheel, or the sail, combined with cuneiform writing, lay the foundations of an emerging urban civilization. The authority of the Lugal, although strong, remains framed by the moral power of the temples, where scribes record victories and failures. Collective memory is now rooted in tablets, sculpted legends, or cylinder seals, ensuring a new permanence to the narratives. The Sumerians thus affirm their identity, revealing to future generations the richness of their beliefs, customs, and achievements. This phase of pre-imperial Mesopotamia ends as some rulers aspire to exceed mere local hegemony. The rivalries between Uruk, Lagash, and Umma, between glorious episodes and bloody fights, shape Sumerian memory and indirectly prepare for major political upheavals. The ephemeral alliances, the beginnings of a centralized administration around the temple and the palace, and the rise of military leaders capable of uniting several cities herald the emergence of a larger political entity. But the notion of empire remains distant. Pre-imperial Mesopotamia is characterized by independent, brilliant, and competitive cities, each keen to defend its lands, canals, and religious traditions. This era, often referred to as the Sumerian Golden Age, is characterized by a powerful internal dynamic, fueled by fertile soils, technical inventiveness, and the intimacy between spirituality and power. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Ur, Kish, Nippur, and other cities participate in this complex mosaic where seasonal alliances and conflicts intertwine. In the background remain the great innovations: cuneiform writing for administrative management, the solid wheel revolutionizing logistics, river sailing that accelerates exchanges, and the standardization of bricks, a driving force behind architectural growth. All these elements will make Mesopotamia a cornerstone of ancient history. This cultural, political, and economic soil will one day trigger the birth of the first empires and leaves a legacy perceptible in the remains of these millennia-old cities, silent witnesses of a foundational era. Mesopotamian history is marked by the fascinating figure of Sargon of Akkad, whose rise gave birth to the first known regional empire. At the end of the 3rd millennium before Christi, numerous kingdoms were competing for resources and trade routes. In this context, the emergence of Sargon, an orphan with an exceptional destiny, is surprising. This section focuses on his ascent, following the accounts reported in ancient and modern sources, addressing his legendary birth, the overthrow of Lugal-Zaggisi, the founding of Akkad, his military reforms, and the anecdote where he washes his sword in the sea, symbolizing the first projection of power of his army. The legend of Sargon's birth describes him as an abandoned infant floating in a basket of reeds. Saved and raised by a gardener in Kish, this story illustrates a child without royal lineage becoming a powerful monarch. Although difficult to verify, this tradition reinforces his image as a hero, a common theme in Mesopotamian narratives. This myth, suggesting divine support, aimed to show that Sargon was the chosen one, destined to reign. Although the birth of Sargon is shrouded in mystery, it is generally accepted that he was not of Sumerian origin, but Semitic from northern Mesopotamia. This is reflected in the language he imposed during his reign, Akkadian, distinct from Sumerian. Sargon is mentioned in later writings as having served at the court of Kish as a cupbearer, a position involving direct access to the sovereign, the responsibility of tasting beverages, and the opportunity to observe the workings of government. This role allowed him to familiarize himself with the intrigues of the court and the rivalries between the Sumerian city-states, including Kish. At this time, several regions were vying for hegemony in Mesopotamia, with cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Ur in constant conflict, notably over water management. Lugal-Zaygisi, king of Uruk, was a formidable military leader, having unified several cities and seeking to extend his power. It is in this context that Sargon, seizing a moment of political weakness in Kish, prepares an audacious coup. Although the exact details of the plot are vague, it seems he gathered a dissatisfied faction to overthrow the local sovereign. Sargon thus managed to seize power in Kish, becoming military leader. He also succeeded in rallying neighboring troops, including Semitic contingents and Sumerian supporters opposed to Uruk's domination. This allowed him to organize an expedition against Lugal-Zaygisi, his main rival. The decisive moment occurs during the battle around Uruk. Ancient tablets recount Sargon's capture of the city, where he defeated Lugal-Zaygisi and imprisoned him. This military victory marks a major turning point in Mesopotamian history. Not only does Uruk, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, fall under Sargon's control, but this victory also grants him an unprecedented status for someone of Semitic origin. This success sparks the creation of a unified coalition, gathering disappointed Sumerian troops from Lugal-Zaygisi and soldiers from more northern regions. For the first time, a single authority encompasses several independent cities, which foreshadows an empire. Buoyed by this victory, Sargon establishes Akkad as the new center of power. Its exact location remains debated, but it is mentioned in tablets as a key administrative and political center, chosen for its neutral character compared to other cities with well-established traditions. The choice of the Semitic name Akkad also marks a cultural turning point, breaking from the Sumerian heritage. Barely founded, Akkad becomes the center of a series of military reforms. Sargon transforms the army into a permanent force, contrasting with the temporary armies of the Sumerian city-states, which were composed of passing soldiers. He implements the phalanx of pikemen, a dense formation of heavy infantry, inspired by Sumerian techniques, but perfected by him. This tactic allowed for resistance against enemy charges and efficient advancement across the flat terrain of lower Mesopotamia. Sargon encouraged the use of the composite bow, a more powerful and precise weapon than the simple bow. Made from layers of wood, horn, and tendons, the composite bow allowed for striking enemies before they approached the phalanx. This technical innovation, likely influenced by the mountainous regions of Iran and neighboring steppes, strengthened the tactical effectiveness of the Akkadian army, combining infantry and ranged fire. Aware of the importance of logistical organization, Sargon maintained garrisons to protect strategic points and instituted a rationalized supply system. Grain, water, and weapon depots were distributed in key cities and along routes, ensuring his army a constant supply. This centralized system demonstrated his desire to control resources and ensure stability in each conquered region. A symbolic anecdote illustrates the sense of power that Sargon cultivated. After a victory, he would have washed his sword in the sea to assert the extent of his empire, stretching from the northern steppes to the shores of the Persian Gulf. This gesture, although difficult to date or locate precisely, embodied his total dominion over the known world, from the land to the salty waters. The symbolism of Sargon's gesture goes beyond Mesopotamian imagery. This ritual resembles a modern projection of power. He asserted his desire to control not only the lands, but also the sea roads, essential for commerce. Expanding to the coast required complex management of river navigation, marshes, and troop logistics. This reflects remarkable coordination, centralization, and discipline, superior to that of rival city-states. Washing his sword in the sea symbolized the ultimate extension of his sovereignty. After this consolidation, Sargon became a central figure in Mesopotamian memory. Texts from the time praise his political intelligence, which enabled him to unite diverse populations under a single banner while respecting local deities. His religious diplomacy, particularly his alliance with the goddess Ishtar, facilitated the transition of power in conquered cities. He integrated local elites and, through his politics and military prestige, established a proto-empire grouping several cities around his capital. Sargon, a simple cupbearer turned king, illustrates how circumstance, strategy, and propaganda shape history. Cuneiform tablets testify to his reforms and his imperial image. By founding Akkad, he created a strategic capital facilitating military control, administration, and trade, marking a break from the previous order. His rise, from an abandoned child to conqueror of Kish, vanquisher of Lugal-Zaigisi, and founder of Akkad, symbolizes the fusion of rival cities into a lasting empire. Sargon reformed the art of warfare, and his exploits, illustrated by the image of his sword drenched in the Gulf, mark a new era. He developed an Akkadian culture, disseminated military and administrative innovations, and consolidated a centralized regime. Considered the father of the Akkadian dynasty, Sargon is the initiator of an influential imperial model. His story, though embellished, reflects the true power he exerted to impose his authority, and his legacy will resonate for centuries, making him indispensable in history. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium before Christ, the empire of Sargon of Akkad becomes one of the most innovative political entities in Mesopotamia. At the heart of this system, the administrative organization stands out for its centralization, unified under a single authority, imposing new practices and rules. This period, the Akkadian era, is not limited to conquest, but also touches on resource management and the exercise of power. The emperor appoints governors, called ensi, to administer the large localities, strengthening his direct control. These ensi, chosen for their loyalty and competence, report back to the capital. Clay tablets, used to manage resources and food rations, attest to the effectiveness of the centralized system. In this context, the Akkadian language becomes essential. Sargon and his successors imposed this language as an administrative and diplomatic tool, gradually supplanting Sumerian in official written exchanges. Scribes, trained in specialized centers, use a unified vocabulary, thus facilitating the dissemination of orders and internal cohesion within the kingdom. The development of commercial networks is a major pillar of Akkadian prosperity. The empire utilizes land and river routes to procure rare resources such as cedarwood, silver from Anatolia, and diorite from Oman. These materials arrive by caravans or boats, are processed, and redistributed in urban centers under the control of imperial administrators who oversee taxes and warehouses. This allows the Akkadian economy to diversify and expand geographically. Innovations also touch on art, particularly with Sargon's victory stele symbolizing his conquests. His triumphant image marks the role of visual propaganda in constructing imperial authority. Copper masks testify to the technical expertise of the time, disseminating a unified imperial art across royal statues and rituals. In a country with irregular flooding, water management is essential for agriculture and security. Akkadian rulers undertake major hydraulic works, like the construction of lateral canals on the Tigris to irrigate new lands and prevent flooding. A specific tax on river vessels is instituted to finance the maintenance of these vital infrastructures. The capital Akkad, whose location remains debated, becomes the decision-making center of the empire. The Ensai receive instructions on the distribution of grains, salaries, and the construction of new buildings. Records found in several Mesopotamian cities reveal the strong expansion of the Akkadian bureaucracy, accompanied by control over the circulation of goods, ensuring the proper flow of resources in the peripheral regions. Trade routes connecting the Syrian steppe, the Anatolian plateau, and the eastern mountains of Iran were traveled by caravans of donkeys carrying metals, precious stones, and foodstuffs. At each stage, checkpoints collected taxes and duties, contributing to imperial finances. The standardization of weights and measures under Sargon facilitated these exchanges, enhancing the empire's influence beyond its borders. The distribution of rations, documented in cuneiform tablets, shows strict management of the empire. Workers, soldiers, and artisans received quotas of barley, oil, and wool according to their roles. Scribes used a sexagesimal system to track accounting. Archives from Girsu reveal that each worker received a specific volume of cereals, often exchanged for other products, thus feeding the thriving cities. With the expansion of the empire, Akkadian became the diplomatic language for commercial and military negotiations. Sargon and his heirs unified the region under a single cultural model, supported by exchanges evidenced in the archives. The Akkadian court encouraged the movement of artisans between major urban centers, stimulating the exchange of techniques and models. Copper from Oman was used to make sumptuous objects, and diorite allowed for the creation of imposing statues. The workshops, supported by the state, were often associated with temples, and the creations were offered to the deities to reinforce imperial legitimacy. Irrigation, crucial for agriculture, was accompanied by rules for crop rotation to preserve fertility. Officials coordinated the opening and closing of canals for equitable distribution of water. Archives from Lagash show that land rest was prescribed at regular intervals, ensuring food stability and reinforcing the authority of the rulers. The victory stele of Sargon reflects the Akkadian imperial ideology, highlighting the figure of the victorious sovereign, a symbol of military strength and political stability. Unlike Sumerian bas-reliefs, which often centered on the protective deity and the city, this work depicts Sargon as the guarantor of cosmic order, legitimized by the gods to rule over a vast territory. On public display, it served as a constant reminder of the empire's dominance over Mesopotamia. The hammered copper masks, particularly the one often attributed to Sargon, offered a more intimate representation of the sovereign. These masks, crafted using advanced techniques, were used in religious ceremonies to emphasize the harmony between the king and the deities. They also expressed Akkadian propaganda, where the image of the monarch was intended to be omnipresent in society. Akkadian power also relied on the collaboration between the palace and the temples, the latter playing a key economic and cultic role. The term egal designated both the palace and the temple house, illustrating the closeness between political and religious spheres. The priests, often appointed by the sovereign, managed important landholdings and organized festivals in honor of the king. In return, the empire supported the construction of sanctuaries, thus reinforcing the loyalty of local authorities. River activity was essential for linking regions. The waterways, true arteries of the kingdom, were punctuated with toll posts featuring imperial taxation. Wooden boats transported agricultural or artisanal products to Akkad, from where land convoys departed. Lateral canals along the Tigris facilitated access to the interior lands, opening up isolated districts. This complex network demonstrates the Akkadian will to control every logistical segment, ensuring rapid and secure delivery of vital resources. The Akkadian Empire thus established a revolutionary model through its centralized administration, its lingua franca, and its artistic innovations, leaving a lasting legacy in the ancient history of the Fertile Crescent. Naram Sin ascended to the throne around 2254, before Christ, succeeding his grandfather Sargon of Akkad. He inherited an Akkadian empire stretching from lower Mesopotamia to the Zagros Mountains. Taking advantage of this base, he developed new political and military ambitions, marking the peak of the empire. Naram Sin adopted the divine title of King of the Four Quarters, signifying sovereignty over the inhabited world, placing him within the divine sphere, thus surpassing the traditional role of a king. This title marks a break from traditions, as kings were rarely considered living gods. Sargon, although having a quasi-sacred status, was never deified. Naram Sin, on the other hand, sought to legitimize his power through the sacred, becoming a civil, military, and divine figure on earth. This transformation granted him absolute power, and official propaganda compared him to divine archetypes. The most striking shift during his reign is illustrated by the Victory Stele. This stele represents the first image of a divinized king during his lifetime, where Naram Sin, wearing the horned tiara, dominates a triumphant scene with defeated enemies. This scene refers to the military campaign against the Lulubi, a people from the Zagros highlands, whom he subdued to secure his borders. Beyond the military event, the stele serves as a propaganda tool. It conveys the image of a king whose divine authority restores order without inferiority to the gods. Naram Sin rises above the fray, marking a rupture with earlier representations where the sovereign worshipped the deities. This divine authority will reinforce his centrality in the Akkadian administration. The campaign against the Lulubai is just one of Naram Sin's many conquests. Other expeditions, notably towards Armanum, aim to secure trade routes and reinforce imperial authority over independent city-states. These victories enhance his prestige within the army and among the elite. Local populations are forced to recognize the sovereignty of the Akkadian Empire, whose power continues to grow. Frescoes and cylinder seals illustrate the logistical efficiency of his campaigns, inherited from Sargon, using the phalanx of spearmen and the composite bow against less structured adversaries. In parallel, Naram Sin consolidates his power by developing imperial urban planning. He fortifies Akkad, the capital founded by Sargon, by raising new walls to symbolize the greatness of the now universal empire. These constructions demonstrate his ability to organize the production of bricks and the transportation of materials over the long term. Naram Sin develops artisan districts to support the needs of the court and administration. Goldsmiths, sculptors, weavers, potters, and scribes settle in centralized workshops, facilitating administrative control. Specialized workshops produce liturgical instruments, ceremonial weapons, and diplomatic objects. This network of artisans around the central power enhances the cultural influence of Akkad, which becomes a major military and artistic hub. Hammered copper reliefs see a refinement, making Akkadian art a model in Mesopotamia. However, internal tensions arise, particularly due to the burden of corvées imposed on local populations. The large construction projects in the army require an abundant workforce, disrupting agricultural production. Peasants, already busy with cultivation and livestock care, must also participate in imperial works, generating discontent. Documents testify to complaints from villages requesting a reduction of these burdens. The administration justifies these corvées by the necessity of maintaining imperial glory. Before the Akkadian Empire, southern cities like Uruk, Ur, or Lagash were dominated by powerful temples economically and politically. The clergy managed vast estates and influenced political decisions. Under Sargon, and especially Naram Sin, this power is reduced as the emperor presents himself as the intermediary between the deities and men. His personal cult, notably after adopting the title of Divine King, gains importance. Sumerian temples are sidelined, and offerings are partially redirected to the capital or to structures controlled by the palace. The royal ideology also spreads thanks to scribes, who write texts praising the sovereign as a relay of celestial powers. The Sumerian cities, attached to their religious and literary independence, feel this phenomenon as a dispossession. The gap between the Sumerian elites, excluded from power, and the Akkadian administrators widens. Some inscriptions show the growing distance between the capital and the ancient urban centers of the south. Historians believe that this marginalization of the clergy provoked opposition, even rebellions in certain cities. Although peace was maintained by the imperial army, this tension fueled criticisms against Naram Sin, accused of neglecting the role of temples and considering himself equal to the deities. The urban project of Akkad can be seen as a powerful empire capable of federating a large-scale workforce, but also as an over-centralization, siphoning resources that were once spread across Sumerian cities. Specialized artisans worked for the palace or officers, while the temples of Uruk or Nippur struggle to maintain their grandeur. As the empire grows, the administration requires more energy, with artisans, scribes, and officers depending on the agricultural surplus from the provinces. A rupture, such as famine or a tax revolt, could weaken the structure, but at this moment, the fear of Naram Sin maintains order. Naram Sin's power raises difficulties, particularly in the Sumerian cities where tributes and taxes are collected to finance Akkad. The commemorative reliefs exalt the splendor of the king, but mask the peasant discontent and the wear of the structures of devotion. Loyal temple leaders receive privileges, affirming the alliance between the throne and the sacred sphere. Recalcitrant cities are monitored and punished, although the documentation is partial. The image of the stele of the victory against the lullaby becomes a symbol of royal domination, reproduced on seals and tablets. Naram Sin reorients royal iconography into a cult of personality, presenting himself as the king beloved by the gods who makes the world tremble. Scribes, increasingly dependent on the palace, disseminate this image. Although there are no direct local testimonies, the emperor seems unreachable without structures to contest his authority. He controls the canals, sanctions the governors, and chooses which temples to favor. In return, artisanal and agricultural production becomes organized, facilitating the circulation of information and rations. Trade links, particularly for wood and access to the Persian Gulf, strengthen. However, this imperial grip weakens social consensus. In Mesopotamian culture, the gods ensure the balance between celestial and terrestrial power. Self-proclaiming as a divine king, as Naram-Sin did, disrupts this balance. Later hymns accuse Naram-Sin of violating customs by elevating himself to divine status and relegating the temples to a secondary role. Although composed later, these hymns critique his reign, where military glory and large-scale projects weakened the spiritual connection between the cities and their deities. Despite this, the Akkadian Empire seems solid. Its military campaigns, divine title, the urbanization of Akkad, and the integration of artisans create a golden age. Internal tensions are managed through coercion and occasional benefits. Naram-Sin's reign brings order, resource centralization, and the emergence of imperial art. Trade routes are protected, and irrigation projects improve production. The hierarchical administration allows for the collection of dues and reallocation of resources. The empire is seen as a machine of control and expansion. The claim to divinity, unprecedented in Mesopotamia, enhances the dynasty's prestige, but incites fear among some priests and Sumerian notables who see the king as a competitor to the gods. Naram-Sin, by adopting the title of King of the Four Quarters, embodies the pinnacle of Akkadian imperialism. He unifies territories under a single master, standing in iconography as equal to the celestial powers. At this moment, expansion seems destined to continue. The contrast is striking between the brilliance of imperial power and the fragility of its foundations. Akkad shines as a significant center, attracting artists, scribes, officers, and merchants. However, rural populations and some religious dignitaries begin to feel the weight of a divine king who demands ever more. The ancient Sumerian elites lose some of their traditional authority. Is the Akkadian edifice durable, or will imperialism eventually reveal flaws? Future events will show the fragility of this ambition, where the sovereign merges with divinity. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reaches its peak, an uncontested power in Lower Mesopotamia and beyond, embodied by a man who proclaims himself King of the Four Quarters. The end of Naram-Sin's reign, ruler of the Akkadian Empire, was marked by troubling events that heralded a major crisis in Mesopotamia. One of the underlying causes was the over-exploitation of agriculture in the south, near the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates. For centuries, irrigation had allowed the cultivation of barley and wheat in an arid region. However, the intensification of irrigation, lack of crop rotation, and insufficient drainage led to an accumulation of salts in the soil. This salinity reduced agricultural yields, making the lands increasingly difficult to cultivate and precipitating an economic and social crisis. In the 3rd millennium before Christ, Akkadian civilization depended heavily on its harvests to feed a growing population. Under the dynasty founded by Sargon of Akkad, the cities of Sumer had been unified. Naram-Sin, his successor, administered a territory where agricultural management was crucial not only for survival, but also for maintaining order and prestige. Surpluses of grains fed the elites, paid the soldiers, and supported the temples. But the intensification of cultivation, coupled with the dry climate, favored the accumulation of salts and harmed fertility and food stability. Due to insufficient technical means to evacuate the excess salt, the farmers were faced with a growing problem. Crop rotation, fallow periods, or better drainage could have slowed down salinization, but these methods were applied too late or incompletely. The cuneiform tablets primarily mention the drop in yields, particularly that of barley, a vital grain for the region. The stocks meant to feed urban populations dwindled, creating mounting tensions between farmers, merchants, and administrators, the latter seeking to maintain tax levels. This signaled the beginning of a lasting imbalance between the needs of the empire and the land's capabilities. At the same time, around 2200 before Christ, the Near East was struck by the climate crisis known as the 4.2 Keir event. Geological studies reveal a sudden aridification, with already scarce rains becoming even more irregular, worsening the drought. In a society dependent on irrigated agriculture, this upheaval only amplified existing difficulties. Water was lacking, and soils became less productive, highlighting the fragility of the Akkadian model. The challenge of storing enough grains to cope with uncertainties quickly threatened to cause famines. Several texts highlight the extent of the shortage, with supply difficulties, rationing, and sometimes the disappearance of certain cereal varieties. Peasant families, already affected by salinization, could not meet the imposed agricultural quotas, leading to tax arrears. In the large cities, rising prices accelerated the impoverishment of households, while merchants, dependent on agriculture, saw their incomes plummet. Artisan workshops lacked markets, and social tension increased. Discontent was heard not only among the most disadvantaged, but also within the administration, overwhelmed by the need to resolve these issues. In this context of uncertainty, the Akkadian imperial system, though seemingly strong, showed signs of fragility. Several cities, previously subject to central authority, took advantage of the situation to challenge the heavy burdens imposed. Adab, southeast of Babylon, was one of the first to revolt against the agricultural requisition and labor systems. In an environment of drought and low yields, these obligations were nearly impossible to fulfill. The inhabitants, fed up, demanded more autonomous management and protested against the perceived unfair taxation. This uprising inspired other cities, thus undermining imperial authority. In Lagash, a strike by scribes, essential to the administration, paralyzed the bureaucratic apparatus. Tasked with keeping accounts and relaying orders, their work stoppage blocked the supply chain, disrupting the distribution of rations and communication between governors and the court of Akkad. This protest reflected the dissatisfaction of a literate elite faced with the deterioration of their conditions, overdue wages, lack of resources in temples, and a tense social climate. Simultaneously, external threats exacerbated the difficulties. The Gutians, established in the Zagros Mountains, intensified their incursions, targeting imperial garrisons on trade routes and in peripheral areas. The Amorites, semi-nomads from the Syrian deserts, also entered Mesopotamia, taking advantage of the Central Power's weakness. Faced with these threats, Akkad had to mobilize more soldiers, increasing pressure on a society already weakened by agricultural woes. Rising insecurity affected trade exchanges, with dangerous caravan routes forcing merchants to hire armed escorts. By river, bands attacked boats transporting valuable goods. Tax revenues fell, forcing governors to intensify collection efforts, which aggravated the situation for farmers and artisans. In this climate of economic and social crisis, a spiritual crisis erupted. In Mesopotamia, religion legitimized royal power and protected the cities. But in the face of drought, threats, and declining yields, the population began to wonder if the gods had abandoned Naram Sin. This doubt profoundly impacted society as priests responsible for interpreting the divine will began to issue critical oracles against the sovereign. The oracles, based on signs such as dreams or omens, accused Naram Sin's pride, who had himself depicted as an invincible and deified king, of provoking the wrath of the gods. Although he took the title of King of the Four Rives and was seen as a great builder, his arrogance was perceived as the cause of divine disgrace. The accusations fueled an already strengthened distrust due to shortages and uprisings. In a civilization based on the harmony between deities and royalty, the questioning of this link weakened imperial legitimacy. The temples reacted differently. Some downplayed the critical oracles to protect the king, while others amplified them, exacerbating a troubled spiritual climate. Processions and prayers multiplied to obtain the gods' forgiveness, while the authorities attempted to restore order. Naram Sin often chose repression, sending troops to Adab and Lagash to suppress insurrections. The striking scribes were forced to resume their work under threat of punishment. However, these displays of force did not resolve structural issues, such as the salinization of fields or the drought linked to the 4.2 Kir event, which required long-term agricultural solutions. Religious troubles persisted as long as the empire was plagued by famine, insecurity, and doubt. Critical texts circulated among scribes and priests, reporting dreams where the gods turned their gaze away from the empire, and wonders such as eclipses or earthquakes, seen as divine punishment. Poor harvests, invasions, and accusations of impiety fueled the idea of the gods' anger, while conjuration rituals reinforced the feeling of a deep imbalance between the divine world and royal authority. The questioning of Naram Sin's legitimacy does not stem from a mere caprice of scholars, but is part of a dynamic of widespread distrust, fueled by malnutrition, precariousness, and fear of the future. Mesopotamian beliefs maintain that cosmic harmony depends on a just and pious king. If the latter claims divine prerogatives or fails to maintain prosperity, divine sanction falls upon him. This viewpoint explains why natural disasters were perceived as evidence of the king's guilt and the god's will to punish his pride. Over time, the interaction of these factors increasingly weakens the empire. Agricultural crisis, aridification, urban rebellions, and foreign incursions put the state under strain. Resources diminish and dissent strengthens. The scribes, despite their return to duty, retain in memory the symbolic strike against a power capable of repressing an uprising, but unable to address the root causes of the crisis. Adab, for its part, remains a hotbed of distrust, likely to lead other cities toward rebellion. The symptoms of weakening are gradual. Salinization persists over several seasons, and the climate does not become favorable after a prolonged drought. Populations endure a continuous degradation of their living conditions, reinforcing their sense of abandonment. While the state granaries empty and the defensive lines crack under the pressure of the Gutians and Amorites, the ideological and religious walls of the empire begin to crumble. The oracles prophesy the worst, and the temples oscillate between ambiguous support for the king and criticism of his blasphemous claims. The emperor seems unable to offer significant reforms to appease the anger. An alarming picture emerges before the empire's collapse. Agricultural problems, such as salinization and the drought of the 4.2 Kir event, reduce yields. Uprisings, such as in Adab and the strike of the scribes in Lagash, show a central power losing its grip. Outside, threats from the Gutians and Amorites force the empire to allocate significant military resources, leaving the hinterland exposed to social tensions and food shortages. Religious dissent, supported by the oracles, questions the legitimacy of the monarchy. Naram-Sin is accused of blasphemy and cosmic disorder, attracting divine wrath upon the kingdom. This rupture between royal power and the sacred is a major drama in Mesopotamian mentality. The gods, supposed to protect the empire, seem indifferent, even hostile, to this monarch who believed himself their equal. For a people facing hunger and insecurity, this religious explanation is more convincing than a technical analysis. Before the collapse, the warning signs multiplied: declining harvests, restless cities, rebellion of the scribes, and fragile borders. The oracles announced the end, designating the king as responsible for a collective catastrophe. Although no one foresaw the immediate collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the combination of economic, political, military, and religious imbalances foreshadowed a tragic outcome. The over-exploitation of agriculture, drought, and divine anger left Naram-Sin and his empire at the mercy of any further shock. At the turning point of Naram-Sin's reign, the once powerful Akkadian Empire gradually sank into an era of troubles. Following the death or withdrawal of Naram-Sin, power wavered and gave way to a succession marked by instability. In this context, Shar-Kali-Shari, who reigned from 2223 to 2198 before Christ, emerged. Although sources are ambiguous about his accession, he is often seen as the successor to Naram-Sin. He embodies the attempt to maintain the integrity of an empire already weakened by wars and internal rebellions. From the moment he came to power, Shar-Kali-Shari had to confront 4 simultaneous armed conflicts, an unprecedented fact for the dynasty. Unlike his predecessors, he was unable to maintain the alliances that had once strengthened the empire. The recovered archives, especially those from Kish, mention wars to the east, north, south, and a threat to trade routes. This fragmentation of military efforts weakened the empire, forcing soldiers to fight continuously, which led to significant losses and a decline in popular support. The greatest tragedy of this period lies in the loss of Elam, a vast territory to the east of Mesopotamia, covering present-day Khuzestan in southern Iran. Elam, once under Akkadian influence, gained its independence and contributed to the empire's collapse. The Elamite cities, taking advantage of the central weakness, freed themselves and formed alliances. Clashes occurred in the Zagros Mountains, where Akkadian garrisons retreated, giving way to Elamite chiefs. An Akkadian general, Atar Ilum, is said to have sacrificed himself to protect a trade route, but this remains uncertain. The loss of Elam marks the irrevocable weakening of Akkadian influence in the region. Although the Akkadian Empire lost its unity, it remained formally under Shar-Kali-Shari for a time. The fragmentary official texts maintained a facade of stability, describing him as a military and religious leader. But behind this appearance, power fragmented. The cities of Lower Mesopotamia, such as Lagash and Umma, plotted with external clans, and within Akkad itself, rivalries led to plots and claimants to the throne. Within a decade, at least 3 individuals proclaimed themselves legitimate kings, muddling the Akkadian lineage. The already fragmented archives were further degraded by wars and destruction. The centers of scribes were dispersed or in ruins, and many tablets were damaged or lost. The temples of Uruk and Nippur, guardians of religious and political archives, also suffered these ravages. Reconstructing this period thus relies on archaeological investigation amidst sealed deposits and rare literary mentions. One document, the List of Later Kings, mentions Shar-Kali-Shari and several rivals, but its condition prevents clear identification of names or dates. One episode particularly draws attention: the discovery of the tablets known as the Curse of the Kings. This text speaks of divine anger against those who disturb the land of Akkad and infringe upon alliances. Several clues suggest it was written during Shar-Kali-Shari's reign, in response to popular anger against the conflicts and usurpations. The Akkadian clerics, concerned about the degradation of the empire, would have invoked Enlil and Inanna to punish the leaders responsible for the chaos. The Curse of the Kings is a desperate appeal to restore a disrupted moral order. According to Mesopotamian mentality, social harmony depended on the relationship between the king and the gods, as well as on the balance based on justice and prosperity. In case of rupture, priests and scribes sought an explanation in divine anger, leading to atonement rituals. This text, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, was recited during official ceremonies and may have been buried under the foundations of palaces or temples to enhance its symbolic reach. Shar-Kali-Shari is becoming increasingly unpopular. Texts calling for divine vengeance are multiplying, reflecting a population burdened by military corvées and requisitions, making him responsible for the general deterioration. The royal court is fragmenting. Some governors, once submissive, are taking their independence and seeking external alliances, hoping for supreme power. This trend further weakens a kingdom already in military crisis. Each time one front is pacified, another rises, maintaining an unbroken cycle of conflicts. The four simultaneous wars striking the empire exacerbate its weakening. In the east, Elamite cities seek to free themselves. To the north, mountain groups linked to the Gudians are beginning to appear, although still few in the plain. To the west, Amorite tribes disrupt trade with Syria. To the south, Sumerian cities refuse to pay tribute or provide contingents. The intensity varies across fronts, but their simultaneity exhausts an already weakened empire. Diplomatically, Shar-Kali-Shari attempts to negotiate truces and sends ambassadors to the recalcitrant cities. However, tolls and taxes are increasing, hindering trade. The river routes, vital for transportation, are becoming unsafe. The few official inscriptions evoke the bravery of the king and present him as the heir of Sargon and Naram-Sin. Yet, behind this propaganda, the empire is on the defensive and unable to resume its expansion. The claimants emerging during these 10 years of troubles each assert a connection to the legitimate lineage. Sources lack details on their origins and support, but figures such as Ilul Yiha, considered a local usurper in the Diyala region, or Ipki Ishtar, supported by merchants, can be mentioned. These individuals likely come from the nobility or military factions, seeking to take advantage of royal weakening to seize the throne. Political marriages are hastily concluded to rally factions to their causes. This period marks an unprecedented fragmentation of power under the Akkadian dynasty. In correspondences found in Mari, a city on the Euphrates, scribes describe these troubles as a great confusion. The loss of Elam profoundly affected regional diplomacy. The Elamite cities, having regained autonomy, could negotiate without Akkadian oversight. The empire thus lost essential metal tributes, notably tin and other precious minerals. According to a fragmentary inscription, Shar-Kali-Shari sent Ilibani as an emissary to restore trade relations, but the Elamites, feeling freed from any obligation to Akkad, rejected the request. They drew closer to the dynasties of the Iranian plateau, further isolating eastern Mesopotamia. Akkad's diplomatic influence consequently diminished, accelerating the fall of the imperial court. The Akkadian administration, once centralized, is crumbling. Rationing tablets intended for soldiers are difficult to implement in distant provinces. Governors, faced with insecurity, struggle to collect taxes and must manage local potentates' hostility. In the temples, priests denounce the decrease in royal offerings. Shar-Kali-Shari allegedly had to draw from the royal treasury to fund his campaigns, depriving the sanctuaries of resources. Some votive statues have not been erected, a sign of the weakening sacred bond. In this context, the curse of kings reveals the intertwining of religion and power. Scribes fear divine wrath and hope that a just and strong king can restore order. The multitude of claimants highlights the failure of a singular authority. Rumors speak of neighboring kingdoms ready to dismantle Akkad. In the face of this threat, the incantation becomes an appeal to celestial powers where weapons fail. The inscription also reflects the fear of abandonment of the tutelary gods towards the descendants of Sargon. The chaotic succession under Shar-Kali-Shari, marked by wars, struggles for legitimacy, and the curse of the kings, symbolizes the transition from a sovereign empire to a fragmented collection of states. His attempts to restore unity fail in the face of advanced dislocation. The allegiance of the cities, often partial, breaks whenever a local opportunity arises. The uncertain datings and confusion regarding the claimants reflect a poorly documented era, where the glory of Akkad gives way to insecurity. This marks the end of an once revolutionary empire, engulfed in conflict. The leaders have little room to maneuver in the face of multiple crises. This period reveals the fragility of imperial structures, overwhelmed by military, political, and spiritual tensions. Mesopotamian archives are generally rich for the dynasties of Sumer and Akkad, but become scarce with the arrival of the Gutians, a period around the end of the 23rd century before Christ. This epoch, characterized by profound changes, deserves attention. Mesopotamia, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq, was divided between the heirs of the Akkadian Empire and the Sumerian cities. Akkad, having reached its peak under Naram-Sin, was weakened by internal problems and a challenging climate. It is in this context that the Gutians, coming from the east, appear. Cuneiform texts designate the Gutians, or Gutium, as mountain populations from the Zagros, at the border of Iran and Iraq. Unlike the urban and agricultural Akkadians, the Gutians did not have a comparable state tradition, presenting themselves rather as clans or tribes led by war chiefs. Although previously mentioned as raiders, they had never posed a serious threat to Akkad. Their lifestyle in the mountains allowed them to conduct raids and take advantage of the logistical difficulties of the mountainous terrain, gradually weakening Akkadian influence over the border regions. To understand the invasion of Akkad by the Gutian tribes, one must recall that after Sargon, the empire was undergoing a period of instability. The successors of Naram-Sin struggled to maintain order, facing revolts and a decline in agricultural production, notably barley, due to soil salinization. This shortage weakened an empire dependent on surpluses to feed its population and soldiers. The Gutians, however, being less dependent on irrigation and accustomed to pastoral life, moved freely, unencumbered by the constraints of managing an empire. They adopted a targeted tactic: attacks on secondary cities, cutting off trade routes, disrupting supplies. Rather than engaging in battle, they harassed the defenses of an already fragile system. Knowing that the Akkadians were poorly responsive in difficult terrain, they probably took the outposts first. Tablets found in the border cities speak of a threat from the east, causing panic in the countryside. The fall of Akkad during a crisis was due to the inability of the imperial court to coordinate rather than the strength of the Gutians. Cuneiform accounts, written generations later, describe this fall as a material and symbolic disaster. Unlike other Mesopotamian conquerors, the Gutians did not seek to occupy Akkad or appropriate its institutions. Their primary goal was pillage. They looted temples, smashed cult objects, and took everything that could enhance their prestige. In a city as centralized as Akkad, this lack of durable control was a cultural shock. Until then, the Mesopotamians had experienced dynastic changes or battles between city-states with the aim of territorial conquests and local resource management. The Lugal, victorious kings, would establish themselves in the conquered city and impose new administrators. But the Gutians, after looting, withdrew without seeking to establish their power, leaving Akkad ravaged and unable to rebuild quickly. The moral trauma was immense. An imperial capital had been sacked without any effort made to maintain the existing political structure. This rapid conquest, centered on the looting of Akkad and raids in the plain, had a domino effect on southern Mesopotamia. The imperial hierarchy collapsed, and the city-states under Akkadian dominance severed their vassal ties. In Ur, local elites took advantage of the chaos to proclaim their independence, just as in Umma, which, after conflicts with Akkad, freed itself from tributes and military contingents. This does not mean that the Gutians took control of Mesopotamia. On the contrary, the documentation shows a political dislocation. Each city turns inward, reforming local alliances to protect itself from mountain incursions. Governors call for caution, suggesting the construction of walls or permanent garrisons. Sporadic alliances form to repel the Gutian groups settled in the east, but without leading to an immediate counteroffensive. The Widener Chronicle, written at the end of the Neo-Babylonian period, contains one of the first explicit mentions of a land without a king after the fall of Akkad. It links natural disasters and religious faults, highlighting the anger of the gods and the arrogance of kings as causes of political downfall. The Gutian invasion appears as a divine punishment. The central theme remains the abandonment of Mesopotamia to violence and chaos after the destruction of its flagship city. For an unfamiliar audience, it is important to understand that the concept of land without a king represented a major anxiety. Since the early Sumerian dynasties, the king assured military and sacred authority, mediating between the city and the gods. Without a sovereign, political and spiritual disorder reigned. The loss of Akkad made this nightmare tangible. Sumerian cities found themselves at the mercy of internal disputes or the fear of new raids. Just after the capture of Akkad, historians place the departure of the Gutian raiders to the north, towards Jebel Hamrin, or the Zagros, to bring back plunder and captives. The disorganized Akkadian elites were unable to form a united front against this threat. Some cities attempted to negotiate with the Gutians by offering tribute in kind, while others, further afield, closed their gates, believing they could preserve their autonomy without participating in a common defensive effort. This explains the sudden autonomy of cities like which, thanks to its trade links with the Gulf region and its grand ziggurat, developed its own networks of influence in the following decades, when climate conditions improved and the Gutians lost their direct pressure. The blow dealt by the Gutians to Akkad had a strong psychological impact. The capital of a reputedly invincible empire fell without offering prolonged resistance, reinforcing their image as a divine scourge, likened to an apocalyptic plague. This representation, likely fueled by later religious reflections, symbolized divine punishment. For the local populations, the fall of Akkad represented a total upheaval of the established order. The religious elites, whose survival depended on royal support, created the myth of the land without a king, a symbol of confusion and helplessness. Militarily, the Gutian conquest was not classical. They left no governors or permanent garrisons. Their rapid passage shattered Akkad's pride. After plundering the treasury and taking grain reserves, they dispersed or returned to the mountains, sometimes to pillage or make agreements with local notables. During this instability, some Sumerian cities attempted to recover, while others sank. Administrative annals reveal a decline in trade exchanges, indicating that caravans avoided insecure areas. For the Akkadian structures, the fall of Akkad led to a legitimacy crisis. If the capital had fallen so quickly, it was because the gods had withdrawn their support from the dynasty. In Mesopotamian mentality, divine approval was necessary to validate royal authority. Losing it meant the erosion of the economic and social foundations of royalty. Scribes sometimes fled to Ur, Lagash, or Umma, where their knowledge remained valuable. This contributed to the dispersion of Akkadian culture, although no single authority was there to promote it. A paradoxical fact emerges. Despite their devastating success, the Gutians did not establish a stable kingdom on the ruins of Akkad. According to later texts, Gutian kings attempted to control certain cities, but the documentation is fragmentary and unflattering. The Mesopotamians labeled them as uncultured barbarians, incapable of managing royal responsibilities. Some myths describe them as devoid of humanity, speaking an incomprehensible language and disrespectful toward the gods. This xenophobic discourse reflects the deep wound left by the Gutian invasion. The Widener Chronicle mentions the first laments over a country without a king, highlighting a political desolation. According to modern extrapolations, this could refer to several years without a sovereign in Lower Mesopotamia. The former functions of Akkad were in ruins, the temples abandoned, and it took decades before a Sumerian dynasty came to replace the Akkadian order. The word lamentation denotes a poetic genre in which the destruction of a sacred city and the rupture of the link with its tutelary god are mourned, as later seen with the fall of in the Lamentations of The Mesopotamians viewed each important city as the residence of a particular deity. The destruction of a city or the abandonment of its temple signified the departure or offense of the god. Similarly, the absence of a legitimate king equated to a vacancy in divine power, intensifying the trauma in the Widener Chronicle. The country between the Tigris and Euphrates no longer had a sovereign to intercede with the gods, rendering any civic organization impossible. Despite the impact of the Gutian invasion, historians note the absence of continuous documentation on the succession of events, the extent of destruction, and the duration of the occupation of Akkad. The city, even in ruins, might have had some inhabitants or attempted to recover, and some Gutian groups may have settled more durably than the sources suggest. However, the Sumerian and Akkadian literary tradition, along with the Widener Chronicle, depicts this period as marked by calamities, migrations, and widespread misery. One of the major effects of the fall of Akkad is the de-imperialization of Mesopotamia. The disappearance of the imperial center allowed the cities to free themselves from tribute and renegotiate their alliances, diluting the idea of political unification. This paved the way for new dynasties, such as that of Lagash, followed by the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, which would restore hegemony over the region, but based on the memory of the Gutian invasion. For a contemporary observer, the destruction of Akkad by the Gutians illustrates how external populations can exploit the internal weaknesses of a crisis-stricken empire. The loss of central power leads to describing the country as without a king, a symbol of total desolation. This motif, taken up in the Widener Chronicle, becomes a symbol of cosmic imbalance. The collapse of Akkad marks a turning point, initiating an era of political recompositions and attempts to restore religious balance. This episode is cited as a warning against pride and the fragility of human constructions. The Gutians will remain tied to this dark period, symbolizing Akkadian shame, though their true motivations remain partially obscure. The Gutian invasion marks the fall of a crisis-ridden imperial capital, with mountain tribes rapidly emerging. This psychological upheaval triggers local independences in Ur, Umma, and elsewhere. The Widener Chronicle, written later, depicts a country without a king, a symbol of chaos and the fragility of power. The lesson from the fall of Akkad remains relevant. Power can collapse in the face of determined invaders and internal crises, giving this event a universal significance. The climatic collapse around 2200 before Christ marked the collective imagination of the Fertile Crescent. At that time, the Mesopotamian populations faced a severe crisis due to prolonged drought and recurring famines. The once abundant harvests diminished, and agricultural surpluses disappeared. Rural communities faced increasing hardships, while scribes recorded the declining yields. This phenomenon is now viewed as a sign of major climate disruption. Through palynology, scientists have reconstructed this upheaval. The analysis of the sediments from ancient marshes shows a significant decrease in hemp and date palms, symbols of the riverine regions of Mesopotamia. This disappearance reveals not only a reduction in moisture, but also the inability of irrigation systems to maintain production. This phenomenon, known as the 4.2 Kir event, affected several regions of the Near East. At that time, the cultivation of the date palm was essential to the economy of Lower Mesopotamia, used for food, the manufacture of ropes, and other artisanal objects. The decline in date production, linked to the scarcity of water, greatly impacts local economies. The sediments also show a retraction of hemp, a crucial plant for textile tools and nets. In sum, this climate upheaval profoundly alters agriculture and the ecosystem as a whole. Political and religious elites attempt to counter the agrarian crisis. The priests, guarantors of abundance, multiply rights to obtain rain, but the drought persists. Despite the efforts of leaders in a complex administrative apparatus, water is lacking, and the canals only distribute a weak flow. In the city-states, panic grows as authorities struggle to supply the population with grain. The archives of Ebla and Mari testify to the extent of the catastrophe. The clay tablets reveal that the rationing of barley, an essential food in the region, is halved. Although emergency rations are distributed, they are insufficient to stem famine, especially since local conflicts disturb trade networks. Poor harvests push the rural population to migrate. Farmers, usually attached to their lands, move to the more fertile regions of the upper Euphrates, less affected by salinization. Archaeologically, we find traces of new settlements, while the great cities of the south empty out, leaving behind silent ruins. This phenomenon contributes to the creation of ghost cities. Once lively with trade and crafts, some sites become deserted spaces. The unused pottery kilns bear witness to the abrupt halt of economic activity. Agricultural sedentism, essential to Mesopotamian civilization, is called into question by these migrations, and the neglected irrigation infrastructures accelerate the decline of the affected regions. Researchers mention a revealing anecdote, a letter from a governor requesting 100 talents of barley to feed the scribes. Found in the ruins of an administrative palace, this letter testifies to the gravity of the shortages and the importance of writing in Mesopotamian society. The scribes, trained in the Eduba, ensure the management of accounts, the distribution of resources, and the transmission of official information. In this desperate letter, the governor, responsible for local administration, expresses his inability to maintain order in his city-state. The shortages of basic goods prevent him from paying the scribes, who are essential for managing the crisis. Without them, no accounting or fair distribution of resources is possible. The request for 100 talents of barley illustrates the urgency of the situation and the struggle for survival in the face of an ecological disaster. This letter also highlights the central role of barley as a unit of measure and exchange. In times of scarcity, it sometimes replaces money to pay workers. Administrative tablets show that scribes were paid in cereals necessary for their survival. The barley shortage disrupts the entire socio-economic structure. Farmers are left destitute, artisans leave the cities, and even the political elite can no longer fund its projects. Despite difficulties, some regions less affected by drought manage to maintain acceptable production levels. New networks of mutual aid emerge, with exchanges of goods at high prices. Merchants take ancient caravan routes, bypassing devastated areas. Barley, wheat, and water become vital goods, often escorted by armed guards. The tablets of Mari testify to tense negotiations where the price of bags of grain is disputed. In a climate of growing insecurity, solidarity has its limits. Politically, the climate collapse redefines power dynamics. Cities with access to external resources retain a certain power, while those in the south, affected by water stress, lose influence. Alliances are formed to secure water supply routes. Cities benefiting from better canals or close to underground sources have an advantage. However, tensions between rival communities multiply, each group seeking to settle on still arable lands. The resilience of populations relies on their capacity to adapt. Agronomists of the time developed varieties of cereals that are more resistant to drought and salinity, improve secondary canals, and optimize water reserves. However, these efforts are not enough in the face of rapid aridification. Historians estimate that this climatic deterioration marks 2 to 3 generations, plunging Mesopotamia into a cycle of migrations, conflicts, and political recompositions. Famine becomes a lasting reality. Later narratives, stemming from oral traditions or scribal literature, sometimes depict this period as marked by great laments, where the gods would have withdrawn their protection from humans. Although the mythological significance of these accounts remains open to interpretation, they illustrate the anxiety of societies struck by calamity. The sanctuaries, once centers of gathering and redistribution, struggle to fulfill their role. Offerings decrease due to insufficient harvests, and spiritual despair spreads. The populations then wonder what faults could have provoked divine anger, leading to such misfortunes. Famine spreads everywhere. The period following the collapse of the unified administration in the Mesopotamian basin is marked by political and administrative fragmentation. This centralized system of sealed tablets, ensuring the authenticity of documents through a network of scribes and seals, gradually dissolves. Each independent city now strikes its own seals, reflecting the loss of a super-regional authority overseeing the entire territory. The clay tablets, previously essential for resource management and the transmission of administrative orders, are now authenticated by individual seals. The fall of the centralized model allows cities to free themselves from this oversight and develop their own validation methods, leading to a diversity of seal styles. At the same time, the Sumerian revenge emerges, designating the resurgence of the Sumerian language after a period of decline. Scribe schools, e-Dubba, become centers of cultural transmission, teaching not only writing, but also Sumerian literature and theology. This renaissance reflects a desire to reconnect with a prestigious heritage and to reaffirm a common identity despite the political crisis. The e-Dubba, present since the early days of Sumerian civilization, become more autonomous with the fragmentation of power. These schools are not only places of education, but also hubs of cultural consciousness, where collective memory is perpetuated through legends and traditional rituals. Documents found in these schools show bilingual exercises in Sumerian and Akkadian, allowing scribes to draft official texts in different regions. These vocabulary lists illustrate the importance of Sumerian as a scholarly language. By reclaiming this language, cities seek to legitimize their sovereignty against their rivals. This Sumerian revenge has a political dimension. Some local princes adopt Sumerian in their titulary or temple dedications as a mark of ancient nobility. Ambitious governors finance the construction of new buildings, sometimes dedicated to the e-Dubba. The Sumerian language, previously religious or traditional, becomes an official language in certain circles of power, reinforcing the cohesion of self-determined cities. Meanwhile, new kingdoms emerge, such as Akkad and Eshnunna, which distinguish themselves by their growth and regional influence. These cities establish their own taxation systems, manage their armies, and enact legal codes. Akkad, sometimes mentioned under different spellings, becomes a fortified city capable of defending its lands and maintaining order. Eshnunna, located near trade routes connecting Mesopotamia and Iran, develops a flourishing commerce. It exchanges cereals, textiles, stones, and metals, and its prosperity attracts elites from trade. The latter weave alliances with other cities, consolidating the power of the city. The first Amorite principalities also appear. These Semitic groups, coming from the west and initially nomadic, settle in agricultural and pastoral areas, creating political enclaves. Although their archives are sparse, they suggest that the Amorites value their warrior tradition to legitimize their sovereignty. Their governance method distinguishes itself from that of the Sumerian city-states. Instead of standardized protocols, they favor a flexible mode based on allegiance to clan chiefs and the distribution of land for military services. This federative system allows for the rapid mobilization of warriors and adapts to migratory movements, ensuring a solid legitimacy for the Amorite princes. The gradual loss of control over the Gulf represents another major axis of this fragmentation. Once, the southern region of Mesopotamia imposed its naval hegemony and taxed many goods, entering and leaving by sea. But now, no central authority is able to effectively monitor the entire traffic. Fleets are becoming rarer, passage rights are scattered from one port to another, and maritime routes are opening up to all regional actors eager to trade on their own terms. The rise of Dilmun, located on the island identified today as Bahrain, proves crucial. This island, long an intermediary between Mesopotamia and the farther southeast regions, benefits from the emancipation linked to the disintegration of the previous empire. Gone is the imperial monopoly and heavy taxes. Dilmun, now independent, develops its port facilities and creates trading posts along the shore. At the same time, Dilmun engages in direct trade relations with Elam, a major entity located in present-day southwestern Iran. For the first time, the route linking Dilmun to Elam is no longer subordinate to a Mesopotamian capital. The exchanges between the two regions involve raw materials, such as copper and diorite, in exchange for Mesopotamian manufactured goods. This new link reinforces Elam's influence, while Dilmun asserts itself as an independent trading hub. This new trading circuit brings direct competition with Mesopotamian cities. These, divided, struggle to procure vital resources and luxury goods. Where a single imperial center once controlled the flows, autonomous ports now favor their own interests. Notables attempt to restore certain commercial agreements, often at the price of taxes or diplomatic compromises. The disappearance of unified standards also complicates exchanges. At this time, official currency does not exist in the modern sense. Weighted money, barley grains, and barter are used. Under a centralized empire, weights and measures were standardized. But with the fragmentation of power, each city adopts its own references, complicating long-distance transactions. Merchants must constantly adapt the calibration of their ingots or the size of their barley bags. In this climate of uncertainty, fragmentation does not only mean decline, it also stimulates innovation. Independent cities create unprecedented administrative rules to preserve their tax revenues and manage public labor. By freeing themselves from a single center, they experiment with new forms of governance. This dynamic is reflected in artisanal productions, with each kingdom seeking to impose its own style, and in religious cults adapted to urban realities. The Sumerian Edubba remain a vector of symbolic unity, despite regional fragmentation. They allow the Sumerian language and its narrative corpus to endure, thanks to local libraries. Itinerant scribes unify the cities by bringing with them sacred texts and hymns. Although politically divided, the Sumerians share common cultural foundations, notably through writing and literary tradition. This 10th section, devoted to political administrative fragmentation, shows how Mesopotamia transforms without a central power. The abandonment of sealed tablets allows each city to forge its own seals, asserting its independence. At the same time, the Sumerian revenge highlights cultural vitality. Sumerian regains followers, particularly in the Idaba, and becomes a tool for princes seeking legitimacy. Rival kingdoms, like Akshak, Eshnuna, or the Amorite principalities, experiment with new forms of politics and warfare while fighting for their survival. Finally, the loss of control over the Gulf allows Dilmun to prosper and establish direct relations with Elam, thus reorganizing the trade network. This dynamic of fragmentation and recomposition lays the foundations for the future of Mesopotamia, with a constellation of powers seeking balance. At the end of the Akkadian Empire, a cultural and identity decline sets in, marking the end of an era that began under Sargon and flourished under Naram-Sin. The grand architectural projects, sculptures, and artistic vibrancy gradually disappear. This period is often linked to political and military upheavals, as well as economic and social instability. The imperial reliefs, typical of Akkadian peak, become rare, and the cities known for their workshops struggle to maintain artistic quality. On an international scale, this decline manifests in a weakening of cultural and commercial exchanges. The elites, once eager to assert their power through monumental works, must manage internal tensions and constant external pressure, notably from the Gudians of the Zagros. Soil exhaustion, deterioration of temples, and the weariness of populations subjected to forced labor further add to these tensions, leading to a gradual decline in artistic creation. The examples from the end of the Akkadian period reveal a radical change in aesthetic conception. The few remaining representations show simplified forms, sometimes referred to as the Gudian purification style. This style prioritizes function over form, seeking to quickly produce ornaments for buildings or to seal documents without concern for refinement. For art historians, this symbolizes not only a retreat of the destabilized elite, but also a sign of identity disarray within the Akkadian kingdom. The myth of the cursed king describes Naram-Sin as the ultimate example of hubris, punished by the gods for proclaiming himself divine and ignoring the warnings of oracles. Although he brought the Akkadian Empire to its peak, these exploits are perceived as acts of defiance against the deities. This narrative, integrated into Sumerian Akkadian literature, depicts him as a sovereign blinded by glory, plunging his people into suffering. In ancient Mesopotamia, the well-being of a kingdom depended on its relationship with the gods, and a ruler perceived as opposing their will was stigmatized. This is what happened to Naram-Sin, whose figure embodied the overreaching monarch, disrupting the balance between the human and the divine. According to some Sumerian priests, his downfall explained the collapse of the Akkadian dynasty, with divine anger manifesting through invasions and natural disasters. This myth persisted well beyond the Akkadian period. Babylonian and Assyrian texts reference it as an example of how terrestrial omnipotence can ultimately end in ruin. The image of the cursed king shaped Mesopotamian historical consciousness, where divine punishment explained many political and climatic upheavals. Another serious concern for contemporaries was the disappearance of Akkad. As the capital and heart of an empire, the city eventually faded into oblivion, to the point that its location remains uncertain today. Since the 19th century, excavations have not definitively located it. Several hypotheses exist. Akkad might be situated north of Babylon or east of the Tigris, but no formal discovery has confirmed these sites. The lack of archaeological traces and the inability to locate the city fuel the mystery. Mesopotamian archaeology is influenced by complex geopolitical factors and climatic changes, making research difficult. The disappearance of Akkad was not a sudden event, but rather a slow decline in administration and culture. Rival cities like and Lagash took advantage of the situation to regain their autonomy, while attacks from the Gutians further weakened the territory. As the city declined, archives and official objects were lost, complicating historical reconstruction. It is now necessary to rely on texts rewritten for political and religious purposes to try to understand the fate of this vanished capital. The last flickers of the Akkadian dynasty are limited in geographic and political terms. Kings Dudu and Shuturul, nicknamed Phantom Kings, rule over a small territory around Akkad, far from the vast conquests of the founders stretching to Syria and the Persian Gulf. Dudu, poorly dated due to a lack of archives, faces the Gutians and former vassal cities. His successor Shuturul attempts to preserve unity by strengthening fortifications, but the empire declines. Administrative tablets become rare and contradictory, signs of growing disorder. Sources mention temple projects, but emphasize the difficulties in raising troops and collecting taxes. Power is dispersing, local leaders are emancipating, alliances are breaking, and border conflicts are multiplying. The king, once a sacred figure, is struggling to rally support. The provinces remain Akkadian, more out of inertia than loyalty. Controlling trade routes and irrigation canals becomes a priority, proof of strategic withdrawal. In this instability, the empire loses its prestige and gives way to new forces in Mesopotamia. Sales documents inscribed on clay tablets illustrate the disorganization of the time. The existence of multiple dating systems coexisting in the same region shows the absence of consensus on central authority. Each city or clan could choose its own reference for dating contracts, the year when Dudu built the wall, or the year when Shuturul defeated such and such Gutian group, complicating the chronology for modern historians. This confusion did not exist during the height of the Akkadian Empire, where the imperial court imposed an official calendar. The crumbling of this centralization reflects the collapse of the empire. In this chaotic context, an archaeological discovery sheds light on the splendor of an ancient royal lineage. A seal bearing the name of an Akkadian princess, found at Sippar, north of Babylon. Carved from a precious stone, this seal, likely reusing an older model, bears witness to the continuity of refined artistic traditions from glorious times. Although it is one of the last examples of Akkadian glyptic art, it symbolizes the aristocracy's attachment to its cultural heritage. The fate of this princess is unknown, but this seal recalls the past grandeur of a civilization in decline. The political disappearance of Akkad does not mark the end of its influence. A new dynamic emerges with the Sumerian resurgence of III, which reorganizes the administrative fabric left wavering by the last Akkadian kings. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, a refined bureaucracy and a standardized system of weights and measures are established. The Ur-III dynasty resumes the centralized management of Akkad while adding documentary rigor and legal codification. giving birth to major historical and legislative writings. Historians emphasize that this Renaissance is strongly inspired by the Akkadian Empire, notably for stock management, workforce calculations, and large-scale projects. Scribes from Sumerian schools perpetuate knowledge inherited from the Akkadians while asserting a Sumerian identity. Ziggurats are restored, temples are rebuilt, and sometimes bricks marked with the names of Akkadian kings are reused. This period marks a transition. The legacy of Akkad transforms. Sumerian becomes the major cultural reference again, while Akkadian remains used in certain administrative circles. Despite the collapse of political power, the imperial memory of Akkad remains vivid in the region. Many sovereigns of Ur III claim to be heirs of Akkad to strengthen their legitimacy, highlighting historical continuity. They reinterpret the figure of Naram Sin, both a model of military greatness and a king punished for his pride. This symbolic recovery allows them to present themselves as spiritual successors of the empire, while distinguishing themselves from its downfall. Beyond Mesopotamia, Akkad's notoriety extends throughout the Near East. Future empires, such as those of the Hittites and Assyrians, will draw on its administrative principles. The Hittites adopt tablet archiving systems, while the Assyrians refine the organization of granaries and trade routes. These influences ensure the survival of administrative, legal, and military structures that will characterize subsequent civilizations. The art of the stele, the cult of the warrior sovereign, and the Akkadian language will continue to exert notable influence. Cuneiform tablets become the basis of regional diplomacy. Although Akkad has disappeared as a power, its legacy endures. Its transmission was not linear, passing through conquests, alliances, destructions, and reconstructions. Mesopotamian cultures enriched themselves through mutual borrowings, creating a continuity that reaches back to the first phases of Akkadian centralization. This disappearance can be explained by a fatal combination of factors. Historians speak of a deadly triangle: over-centralization of power, ecological crisis, and external military pressure. Akkad had centralized its administration to control a vast territory. What became a strength turned into a weakness in the face of external enemies, soil degradation, and a rigid economy. The Gutians, adept at harassment, exploited this centralization, while aridification and salinization weakened agricultural lands. Subsequent Mesopotamian rulers, from Ur III or elsewhere, took advantage of the Akkadian legacy while avoiding its mistakes. This end of civilization shows that excessive rigidity and constant conquest are not viable without adaptation to climatic changes and regional dynamics. The universal lesson is clear: material complexity, imperial ambition, and lack of environmental resilience hastened the fall of a civilization convinced of its eternal power. This chapter on the last phase of the Akkadian Empire concludes in twilight, later illuminated by the Sumerian dynasties and the heirs of Sargon and Naram Sin.